Hey everyone, it's Jaclyn from Longarmingbyjaclyn, and we've been doing kind of a series on quilt design. So this series is if you are making choices for a quilt that you're making yourself, or if you are trying to communicate what you want to someone who's making the quilt for you, and you're going to order a custom quilt from someone who does that in your life that you love. So let's get into, today we're going to talk a little bit about theme. And we are going to talk about orange. So all of these fabrics are orange on some level, but they're very different oranges. And the one that you would choose is going to depend, I want a quilt with a lot of orange. Great. So tell me a little bit about your theme so that when I'm choosing oranges and choosing fabrics, they're going to add up to and express the theme you want to express in your quilt. So let's take a look at these particular oranges I've picked out today. So here we have our 5 oranges. So this one's very pastel. It's got a little scattered butterfly on it. This one is not quite pastel, but it's a little more muted. This one is pretty bold. This one's bold with a little bit more red. We're kind of going from yellow to red. And then this one is kind of an orange-based graphic. Let's call this like a harvest theme that features the orange but isn't entirely orange. So this one is the most obvious. It's got strong thematic elements in the novelty print itself, which is going to lend this to, the fabric's already pretty graphic. It's already pretty high contrast, and it's already got a harvest theme. So this one is going to be sort of the most easy to classify, but also the most pigeonholed. This fabric is pretty specific. It's going to go into a pretty specific quilt. Unless you're going totally scrappy and you're cutting this so small that you're sort of breaking down the pattern, this one kind of tells you where it wants to go. So there's our darkest one. I've sort of arranged these from lightest to darkest. This one is a bold, saturated color, and it's a high energy color. So any quilt that this goes into is going to have a high saturation. It's going to be pretty bold, and you're going to end up with more of a graphic quilt with this strong color. And same thing applies to this lighter orange, just a little bit less so. You can see if I took a black and white photo, which I will insert here, this one is going to read much darker and more saturated. And then now we're getting into a softer color. So if you are trying to convey something soothing and restful, maybe for a baby quilt, it's a little bit warmer, softer, it takes the edge off, there's less contrast. So this is bringing up words for me more like cozy, whereas this is a little more graphic and bold. And I would venture to say that these two have more elements of a pink in there. And if I were trying to create a more feminine theme, I would lean more towards these softer pinky tones than these sort of graphic angular tones. Okay, so those are our fabrics. Now let's start to build a theme and put some complementary fabrics and see what that does to our color story. So I've got this strong magenta, and I'm going to say this is a no. I'm going to say, except in maybe using them sparingly, that's not really building a theme for me. However, the saturation of this is working well for me with both of these two fabrics. So this could create a bold, saturated quilt. If somebody likes strong colors, they like a lot of energy, these are tied together. So that's our element of unity. These are warm, saturated colors, and they're going to be high energy and sort of graphic. So these could be combined and start to build your color palette if that is what you wanted to create. So say this person needs to be energized, and they're a vibrant person and you want to bring out sort of a youthful energy in a powerful way, this would be a great start to a palette like that starts to tell that story. So again, you'd be surprised how you can use small amounts of fabrics, or maybe fabrics far from each other. But in my way of thinking, I'm not really building too cohesive of a color story by bringing this magenta into this sort of harvest color. So I mean, someone could surprise me and pull this together beautifully, but I'm not feeling this color story with this particular sort of hot pink color. Okay, now I'm going to bring this softer sort of teal color into the color story and see what kind of themes this is going to bring out and start to build for us. Let me start with my pastel. So this is very soft, and you can see the contrast between them. They're in a similar value, which means if I took a black and white picture, which I'll insert here, not too far off in how much kind of pigment, how much darkness shows up in the two of them. So they're similar, which is going to create sort of soothing colors. So if you wanted more of a cozy, softer, a lot of times when we are making quilts for like an infant, we're going for more of this pastel color family because it's going to help them sleep and relax. So that would create kind of a baby quilt vibe. And even though this is like a peachy color with this much teal in there, that could actually go for a gender neutral quilt. If you wanted to go gender neutral, or if you do not yet know the gender of the baby, this is kind of a good generic color palette that starts to build. So let's go on to our little bit more saturated orange. I could see these used together. It's not creating a strong statement. They're extremely similar in value. You're going from cool to warm. It's kind of quiet. It's got a washed out, maybe more beachy vibe to it. So I could see us building sort of a beachy, muted, more in that home decor vibe with that. I don't know that I am loving this teal color with these more saturated colors. If I were doing a color wash and I were building that saturated quilt, I could see them maybe coming into play in that same sort of graphic color wash quilt. It is kind of interesting with this orange. It does kind of cool it down. So if you were using a little bit of this as an accent color, they don't clash, but it's definitely a more graphic and energizing energy that's coming out of these oranges. And then I could see this being used as a neutral or background with this more graphic harvest print and sort of chilling out everything that's going on here. So you've got the contrast of this is dark, there's a lot of graphic, high contrast things happening in here, there's warm colors, there's black, which is quite a strong color in a quilt, and then a lot of this teal would sort of serve to chill it out and give your eyeball a place to rest. So a small amount of this in maybe the detail part of your quilt and a lot of this in the background would tone down all of this energy and kind of cool it out a little bit. So if you like this fabric, but you don't want your quilt to be so over the top with this energy, you could contrast it with a nice teal, sort of chill out the energy, ratchet down all of that graphic power. So I mentioned black. Let's look at some black fabric, which it is black and neutral or not? Kind of. But let's look at it with this peach fabric. This isn't giving me a strong color story or a strong theme here, and the black is overbearing and overpowering this pastel shade. So maybe using a fabric with some notes of black in it with the pastel, but we're washing out this pastel and sort of taking away its soft, cozy nature by pairing it with too bold of a background. So let's go. We're getting a little better here. if you used a small amount of black and a good amount of these sort of soft, not quite pastel, but kind of dusty muted colors, you could create a few edges and focal points with a little bit of black. But again, it's kind of overpowering. The starkness of this black fabric is taking away from the softness of the color story that we're going to with this kind of a color. So we've got our sort of middle high saturation twins here, and these would create a very high energy. In fact, doing a color wash with a lot of similar value saturated tones would actually create sort of a harmony, and sort of there's a unity to how your eye slides across that. And by adding this black, it becomes much more graphic, and honestly, it's getting a lot of Halloween vibes. And then same thing, we've got our harvest print featuring orange. It does tone down everything that's going because black is still. So we were talking about how black is a still color, especially this in a solid. And it's like a black hole. Your eye is going to fall in and sink into this black. So this has a lot of movement, and the solid black is going to have some stillness. So it will help to sort of calm down and unify as your eye slides from these pops of color into the solid black. Okay, so we talked about black being a pretty bold color statement, maybe not quite as neutral as we thought. So let's go ahead and look at a gray. And this is a very soft gray. It's got a subtle pattern. Depending on how big or small you cut this, it can look a little bit more like a pattern. In a huge area, like a big block, this is going to start looking more like a texture. And if you have a smaller block, it's going to show up more like a pattern. So let's start with our pastel. Again, it's a very soft color story. This sort of dovey gray is emphasizing the softness, the sort of quiet, muted nature of this pastel, and it really lets the richness of this peach start to pick up. So good for a young person's quilt, or anybody where you're trying to sort of pick up a cozy, soft, they're both warm colors. This is a warmer gray. So it's going to be a cozy, soft, soothing, sort of restful color palette. And let's look at it with our not quite pastel. Same thing, a little bit more energy than the pastel, a little bit closer in value than the pastel. But you're building a similar color story. This one might be a little more gender neutral and adult because this has a lot of pink notes in it, which is going to give it a more leaning toward babies and more feminine. And this one's a little more gender neutral and a little more, I would say, age neutral, but still keeping that soft vibe, keeping that soothing and cozy vibe going. So that's the kind of theme we'd be building with this fabric combination. I don't know that I love this with this orange. In small amounts, used judiciously as part of a pattern. I'm not going to say these would never appear successfully in the same quilt, but I'm not getting a strong story from the combination of these two colors. I feel like the saturation here and the yellowy tones are not landing properly with this soft dovey gray. So I don't know. You might surprise and delight me and deploy these two fabrics together and it tells a great story. But just that combination right there is not giving me a strong vibe and a strong theme. And this one, even worse. I would say we're even further from combining them. We're so overpowering with this orangey red solid to this dovey soft gray that I'm not feeling a strong story by combining these two fabrics. And we're definitely overwhelming the dovey gray with our graphic harvest print. I will say though, in place of a white, which is pretty stark and a pretty hard contrast to the black background, this might soften the contrast and mellow the energy. So contrast is a sharp change from one to the next. If you can make a softer change from one to the next, the amount of up and down like a roller coaster goes down, that crisp graphic energy goes down, and it would soften it up. So maybe replacing white with this dovey gray would be a way to pick up this theme, but maybe notch it down and soften it just a little bit. So we had our soft dovey gray, and this is a more, let's call it true gray. It's a medium mid-tone gray. If you have a photography studio, this is probably pretty close to that gray color that they put in the corner and judge your color correction off of. So let's have a look at this more true gray against our colors and compare that to our sort of dovey gray and see what kind of a story that builds. I'm doing these together and you'll see why. So the contrast between the deep gray and the black is even softer than the contrast between the soft gray and the black. The jump in color from this to this is less. Now, stripes are a very energizing pattern. They're a very graphic pattern in their own right. So this particular fabric is not going to tone down this print, but the gray color does. This is less of a strong stripe to it. So this definitely starts to tone down, and the jump from this fabric to this fabric is softer and a little bit less. So we can use our harvest print and take a little bit of the energy out of it by pairing it with this kind of deep middle tone gray. Maybe not the stripe. You see the color does its job, but the energy in this pattern is a little competitive to letting our focal fabric shine. Now let's take a look at these four fabrics together. Again, these middle tones are going to give us versions of a similar theme. This is actually the most toned down this color has looked. So you've got a little bit of oomph and value from this deeper gray. You don't have too graphic of a pattern going on, and it starts to balance the power of this bright sort of yellowy orange solid and tell a little bit of a softer story. And we're getting into more of a fall story by pairing it with this deeper gray. And because it's a solid, it can probably take the energy of a stripe next to it. There's not too much competition of your eyeball between strong prints there. And then similar, but a little bit warmer when we get into this red color. Oops, what am I doing? Ha. And we've got two pretty saturated values going on. I think I actually like the energy of the stripe sort of picking up and breaking up the heaviness of this red-orange color. So we're getting into more of a fall color story, and we're starting to break up sort of the color wash story if we had combined all of our solids together, which is a good color story. But we're starting to break it up and tone it down and sort of add a different energy to dilute this saturation. And I think this would build a nice kind of fun, high energy harvest or fall quilt. And I think if I were doing more of this color, I might pull this one, which is a little less graphic, a little more of an all over gray. And we saw how the very soft gray and the black both struggled to be combined in some of these color stories. And you're seeing that this dark gray is more neutral because it is pairing successfully with more different fabrics. So this is a little bit more saturated and a higher value than our dusty, not quite pastel orange, but it's still a soft transition. this would still be a fun and interesting, but sort of soothing, more neutral, more relaxing color story with either one of the deep grays. Going with a solid lets us use this stripe with reckless abandon because we don't have to worry about the graphic nature of the stripe competing with a hero print or a novelty print that's going to have a little too much going on for your eyes to understand. So this is nice. It's grown up. I would say age neutral. You could make a quilt with this color story for a younger person or an older person, and it would be appreciated equally. And then let's have a look at our pastel. And as soon as we pair this with the more pastel shade, with the pinky hues, these same fabrics are still neutral, still soothing, but it's definitely picking up a little bit of a more juvenile, younger energy, and probably a more feminine energy with the amount of pink in here. So a little bit of a longer video, but I think we covered a lot. So when you say orange, it's more telling to tell me the vibe of the quilt, and then I will select from all of the many oranges that could show up in a quilt like that, or whether orange is part of the story at all. And when you tell me you want it to be, you know, this color in your arsenal, if you are buying fabric, is so usable in so many color stories, and it can sort of soften up a little bit but still have enough interest. When you are using colors, whether they're accents or backgrounds, in these families, you're really expressing something a little more clear. Black is a distinct fabric, and it really draws your eye in, like a black hole you're falling in. So this is a strong fabric. It's going to make a strong statement, and you need other things in your quilt that are strong enough to stand up next to a color this powerful. This fabric is more soft and delicate. It can be overwhelmed, just like your pastels can be overwhelmed. So when you're choosing fabrics to go with this, you're really leaning into a quilt that's going to be described as soft, soothing, cozy, that sort of a look. And you have to be careful not to overpower him with powerhouse colors that aren't going to make sense and build the same story as a gray like this. And you will notice that this print is more textural. This print is a little more graphic. So with our graphic quilt, we had a little bit more trouble using it. It adds a lot of energy. It adds a very specific look to a quilt. But if you use this stripe with a strong print, you're going to start to create competition, and your eye is trying to take in too much at once, and there's nowhere for it to go. So the other thing about theme is it's easier to deploy a solid fabric than a print fabric. You have to be more careful using a print fabric. You want to use fewer of them, and you might think about doing, I mean, these are butterflies, but from here you don't even really see the butterflies. It's a little bit more of a texture. So small, sort of unobtrusive prints start to function more like a solid. They're easier to use in quilts. They don't tell so specific of a story on their own that you have to be careful how you use them with other things to build your story that you want to share. So I hope this was helpful. I hope it was interesting, and I would be curious to know if this is something you would use when choosing your own fabrics, or it's just helping you figure out what to say when you're ordering a quilt from someone else. I would be interested to know. And if you have a problem fabric, or you have a problem quilt that you're trying to create for someone and you know the vibe, but you don't know what fabrics to put in to create that vibe, let me know below, and we'll see if we can come up with a video to answer your questions about how to design your quilts. And today we talked about theme, so we can express the theme you want to express with the quilts you select or buy. So have a great day. Happy What You Sewin' Wednesday, and enjoy.